-40. The wind is moving across open prairie at 60 miles an hour, carrying snow that erases the world in every direction. And inside a shelter made of nothing but wooden poles and animal skin, a child is sleeping deeply, warmly, without fear. Think about that for a moment, because most of us live in homes with central heating, insulated walls, and thermostats we can adjust from our phones, and we still complain about the cold. The first European travelers who crossed these plains in winter wrote that no human being could possibly survive out here. They were describing a place that, to the nations who had lived on it for centuries, was simply home. Now, you might assume the answer is the teepee itself, that clever cone of hides and poles. But the teepee was never the secret. It was only the visible part of something far larger, far harder to see. Because on that same freezing night, inside that same shelter, one person was not sleeping at all. They stayed awake until the sky turned grey, and the reason had nothing to do with fear. To understand why, we have to go back not to the moment the shelter was raised, but to a decision made weeks earlier. That decision was where to stand. Long before a single pole was raised, someone had already read the land the way you or I would read a page. The strongest winter camps were almost never built out in the open. A tree line, the low bank of a river, the gentle back of a ridge, each of these slowed the prairie wind before it ever reached the shelter. A south-facing slope collected what little warmth the winter sun still offered. A stand of cottonwood nearby meant firewood, and firewood meant survival, but every advantage came attached to a cost. A deep valley blocked the wind beautifully, and then filled with heavy freezing air after sunset, sinking colder than the ground above it. A wall of rock gave shelter, until snow or stone came down from it in the night. So they were never really looking for the best ground. They were looking for the ground with the fewest mistakes in it. And here is a detail most people never hear. The lodge itself belonged to the woman. She built it, she repaired it, she owned it, and she decided where it would stand. A practiced group of women could raise a full teepee in about an hour, and take it down in less. What they raised was quietly brilliant. The cone let the wind slide around the shelter instead of slamming into it, and let heavy snow slip off before its weight became dangerous, while lodgepole pine bent with the strongest gusts rather than snapping under them. And the doorway always faced east toward the first light of morning, and away from the storm winds that came across the plains. To modernize, that sounds like ceremony. In reality, it was both prayer and engineering, and no one there saw a difference between the two. But the outer hides were never the thing keeping that family alive. Inside, there was a second layer, hanging from the poles, running all the way around the inside wall, and reaching from the ground up to about shoulder height, was a second skin, a liner, and it changed everything. Cold air always finds the bottom edge of a shelter, no matter how carefully that shelter is built, and in an ordinary tent, that air comes in low and crawls straight across the floor where people are sleeping. Here it couldn't. The liner caught it, turned it upward, and sent it climbing through the narrow channel between the two walls, up and over and down toward the center, where it arrived exactly where it was useful feeding the fire. They didn't block the cold. They gave it a job. And the hides doing that work were not ordinary leather. Winter buffalo hide carried a dense coat of fur, and inside that fur were millions of tiny pockets of trapped, motionless air, which is the same principle behind every insulated wall built today. A family-sized lodge took somewhere between 12 and 20 of those hides. Each one was a hunt. Each one was days of scraping and tanning and work. That shelter wasn't just where a family lived. It was the largest thing they owned. Even the storm was put to use, because snow drifting up against the base sealed the last small gaps where wind could enter, and the enemy outside quietly became another layer of insulation. At the center, the fire stayed small, burning low in a shallow pit, while two adjustable flaps at the top turned the whole structure into a living chimney. And now you know why someone had to stay awake. They weren't watching the fire, they were watching the wind, because when the wind shifted and the flaps did not shift with it, the smoke came down instead of up, and a sleeping family simply would not wake. But smoke was not the great killer of a plains winter. Neither was cold. It was something the body makes on its own. It was sweat. A man who worked too hard hauling wood in the last hour of daylight would walk back to camp with damp clothing against his skin, and wet clothing pulls heat out of a body many times faster than dry air ever could. So there was an unwritten rule out on that prairie, and every child learnt it early. Get home before you feel warm. Slow down before you sweat. Out there, exhaustion was not a weakness, it was a wound. And once you were inside, the next enemy was already waiting underneath you. Because heat doesn't only escape upward into the air, it drains downward into frozen ground all night long. So the floor was built as carefully as the walls. First came woven mats of willow or reed, lifting everything up off the cold earth. Then thick layers of dried grass, holding still air the way that buffalo fur did. And on top of that, heavy robes laid fur side up, so the softest surface caught body heat, while the tough hide underneath stopped every draft from below. On the worst nights, smooth river stones were heated at the edge of the fire, wrapped in hide, and slipped beneath the sleeping places, where they gave back their warmth slowly for hours after the flames had settled. And then came the part that tells you who these people were. In a 40-below night, the warmest place in that shelter was never given to the strongest. It was given to the smallest and the oldest. The healthy adults slept on the outside, closest to the cold. That was not kindness, that was the rule. The Lakota say, Mitakuye or Yasing all are related, all are my relatives. On a winter plain, that was never just a beautiful prayer. It was a survival strategy, written down as faith. And these families did not count the years the way we do. They kept time in a way that still astonishes historians. They kept what are called winter counts, Wan Ye Tu Wawapi, a history painted onto buffalo hide, where every year received exactly one image, not a number. One picture, for the single thing most worth remembering, and the year was named for it forever after. The winter the stars fell, the winter the horses came, which means a life on the plains was never measured in birthdays. It was measured in winters survived, and surviving them took more than hides and fire. It took a person who could look at the shape of a cloud, the direction of a shifting wind, the restlessness of a bison herd, or the flight of birds, and know what was coming before it arrived. Someone who knew which wood burned hottest, and knew when it was wiser to move the whole camp than to stand and take the storm. The dogs listened while the people slept. The lodges stood in a circle, so that every family could see every other family. And that is the answer to the one question we left open at the very beginning. The person awake through that night was not alone either. They took shifts. No one watched the wind until morning, because no one was ever asked to survive by themselves. That was the entire design. By dawn, the storm had passed. The snow lay deep across the prairie. The fire still glowed low in its shallow pit, and a child woke up warm. That was not a miracle. It was not luck, and it was certainly not primitive. We insulated our houses. They insulated each other. If this is the kind of history you want more of, stay with us, because the things we've forgotten are usually the things we needed most.